She entered that marriage as if signing a sentence, without love, without touch, without choice. He was the kind of man who learned to master the world by silencing his own heart. But on a night where there was supposed to be nothing, there was a kiss, and then silence. A silence so cruel it seemed to deny everything the eyes had screamed, until an impossible truth knocked at the door. She was pregnant, by a man who pretended not to feel, by a night he wanted to forget. But what happens when what was a contract turns into affection, and when the stone heart hears for the first time the sound of a cry and understands what it means to love? You're about to discover a story that begins in silence, crosses through pain, and ends where few dare to go. In real love, the kind that's built even after pride, hurt, and absence. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments where are you listening from? Your like helps this channel grow and continue bringing moving stories like this. Share with someone special. No one chooses to be trapped, but sometimes the most beautiful cages are made of diamonds, contracts, and family names. Victoria Campbell stood by the towering glass windows of the bridal suite at the Plaza Hotel, gazing at the city below, its lights flickering like stars in a distant sky. Her reflection in the glass was flawless, a custom-designed wedding gown hugging her figure, soft waves of chestnut hair flowing over her shoulders, and a veil fit for royalty. But her eyes, they were distant, detached, resigned. Downstairs, 100 guests were sipping champagne, celebrating a union they believed to be a love story. But this wasn't love, it was legacy. Victoria, a brilliant lawyer known for her relentless determination in courtrooms and her unmatched ability to stay composed under pressure, was now facing the one case she had never wanted to take. A marriage arranged to merge empires. Nathaniel Hayes, tall, stoic, with a face carved by power and a gaze that rarely betrayed anything, was the CEO of a luxury hotel chain with properties spanning continents. His name carried weight in boardrooms, and his silence in interviews only made him more mysterious. He was everything the tabloids fantasized about, and everything Victoria avoided. But their families had other plans. The Campbells and the Hayeses had been intertwined through investments, charities, and discreet dinners for decades. When both families realized that their heirs were still unmarried at 30, avoiding any semblance of romantic commitment, a decision was made. Not suggested. Made. Victoria agreed out of sheer exhaustion. After years of resistance, of trying to carve a path all her own, she saw that her choices always circled back to what her family expected. Nathaniel. Well, no one knew why he accepted. Maybe it was strategy, maybe boredom, or maybe deep down he was just as weary as she was. The wedding was extravagant, a headline event. Lace imported from Italy, vows scripted by publicists, guests from Monaco to Dubai. But their eyes never met during the ceremony, not once. After the applause, after the photos, after the carefully staged kiss on the cheek, they left the plaza and entered a black car waiting in silence. Their home, a penthouse in Tribeca, looked like something out of an architecture magazine. Open spaces, minimalist elegance, city views that seemed too perfect to be real. But when they stepped inside, it felt more like two strangers moving into the same hotel room than a home. "Your room is on the left," Nathaniel said, his eyes never meeting hers. His voice was neutral, polite, as though speaking to a temporary business associate. "Thanks," she replied, walking past him without slowing. Her heels echoed on the marble floor. That was the first night, and every night that followed carried the same hollow tone. Their routines were choreographed in unspoken agreement. She woke early, he worked late. She took breakfast in the kitchen. He ordered coffee to his office. Separate bedrooms, separate lives. Yet something lingered in the silence. There were nights when Victoria would pass him in the hallway, and their shoulders would almost brush. A hesitation, a breath held too long, a glance that lasted a second longer than it should. But nothing ever happened, not even a question. She found herself watching him sometimes, how he loosened his tie at the end of a day, how he ran his fingers through his dark hair when reading late into the night, how he stood still in the morning light, drinking coffee with a sadness she couldn't explain. Nathaniel too noticed things he wouldn't admit. The way Victoria carried herself, confident yet guarded. The way she folded her clothes with intention. The way she bit her lip when concentrating on her laptop. Her scent lingering in the hallway after she walked by, but instead of leaning in, he stepped back. Every gesture between them was laced with something unspoken, but no one dared to speak, because speaking might break the illusion, and the illusion was all they had agreed to. The world saw them as a power couple, elegant, intimidating, perfect. But inside that glass castle in Tribeca, they were just two people trying not to drown in the silence. And yet silence has a funny way of building tension, the kind that doesn't scream. It waits, it watches, and eventually it erupts. There is a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being unseen, from living under the same roof as someone who never looks at you long enough to truly see you. In the weeks after the wedding, Victoria and Nathaniel became experts at coexisting without colliding. They were like two parallel trains running on separate tracks, close enough to feel the vibration of the other, but never touching, not even by accident. Their Tribeca penthouse had enough space for them to avoid each other entirely. And that's exactly what they did. Mornings began early for Victoria. She'd make tea in the quiet of the kitchen before heading to her office downtown. Her heels would echo faintly through the hall as she passed his closed door. No good mornings, no acknowledgement, just silence, polished, practiced, precise. Nathaniel, in turn, worked late into the night. He preferred the solitude of his office, where soft jazz hummed through discreet speakers and floor-to-ceiling windows swallowed the city lights. When he returned from meetings or events, she was already asleep, or pretending to be. They shared the same address, the same last name, the same building registry, but nothing else, and yet something lived in that silence, a presence, a quiet, pulsing tension that filled the space between them. It wasn't hostility, it wasn't resentment, it was curiosity, maybe, or something neither of them could name. Victoria, for all her composure, found herself becoming acutely aware of Nathaniel's existence, not in the way wives notice husbands, but in the way someone notices a storm forming on the horizon. The sound of his footsteps down the hallway, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the elevator, the way he said her name when addressing something formal. Victoria, the accountant, sent the tax documents for review. He always said it cleanly, without affection, without emotion. Still, his voice stayed with her longer than it should have, and Nathaniel, guarded and efficient in all things, started noticing her too. Noticing the things he shouldn't, how her laugh sounded when she spoke to her best friend on the phone, how she always folded her sweaters the same way, how she sometimes stood on the balcony at night with a glass of red wine, her bare feet on the cold stone floor, as if trying to feel something deeper than the luxury beneath her. Once, during a thunderstorm, the lights flickered in the hallway. Victoria was on her way to the kitchen, barefoot, hair tied up messily, wearing one of his oversized Oxford shirts she'd grabbed without realizing. They bumped into each other, just for a second. But in that second, something shifted. He looked at her, really looked. And she froze under his gaze, feeling exposed in ways her legal briefs never made her feel. There was no accusation in his eyes, no flirtation either, just stillness, observation, as if trying to memorize her. And then it was gone. He stepped aside. She passed. Neither said a word, but that night neither of them slept. Victoria began to resent the silence that once protected her. It was no longer a shield. It had become a wall, thick, cold, and unbearably quiet. She missed noise, laughter, arguments, anything that proved something real was happening between two people. Instead, there were polite emails sent from one room to another, calendar invites for shared charity events, notes on the fridge that said things like, "I'll be out late," or "The plumber's coming at 10, it was all too civil." Too perfect. And perfection, she realized, was the enemy of intimacy. Sometimes she wondered if he ever thought about that night, the wedding night, where everything had begun, But nothing had really started. The bed had stayed untouched. The conversation brief. He hadn't tried anything. She hadn't wanted him to, but still part of her had waited. For a gesture, for a question, for a human moment. It never came. Nathaniel, in his own quiet turmoil, wasn't as unaffected as he appeared. He would catch himself pausing outside her door at night, hand almost lifting to knock. But never quite. He didn't understand her. And that terrified him more than he'd admit, because the truth was he was used to being in control. Of businesses, of negotiations, of people. But Victoria wasn't someone to be managed. She was fire wrapped in silk, logic wrapped in empathy, and every time he watched her walk through their shared space, he was reminded that he wasn't brave enough to open the door to whatever it was he felt. Instead, they continued their silent dance. She would leave a book on the coffee table, and days later he'd pick it up and read it. He'd reorder her favorite almond butter when it ran out, never telling her, just placing it quietly in the pantry. She'd leave a cup of tea on his desk some mornings, never saying it was from her. Little acts of almost care, echoes of a closeness that didn't yet exist, but maybe wanted to, and in those small gestures lived the question neither dared to voice. What are we doing? They weren't lovers, weren't enemies, weren't even friends, just two strangers pretending not to ache in the same space. But silence has a strange power. It can grow roots. It can become unbearable. And eventually, it demands to be broken. It started with thunder, not the kind that simply rolls across the sky and fades, but the kind that vibrates through your ribs and warns you that something is about to shift. Manhattan had been swallowed by storm clouds since the early morning, but no one had expected the benefit gala to end like that, stranded, reined in, and far from home. The Hayes family's annual charity event had taken place at a private estate in Hudson Valley, a lush, historic mansion that Nathaniel's grandfather once called home. It was one of those places that smelled of memory. Old oak floors, fireplaces that had seen 100 winters, and portraits that watched you like they knew your secrets. Victoria hadn't planned to attend. She hated these events. The press, the masks, the whispered judgments from women in borrowed kindness. But she had put on her black gown anyway, matching her lipstick with restraint, her patience with effort. She showed up. For the family, for the image. Nathaniel had greeted her, with a nod when she arrived, but nothing more. They didn't speak much through the night, just exchanged glances across candle-lit tables, trapped in polite conversation with donors and diplomats. But as the final speech ended and guests prepared to leave, the rain exploded against the windows like a warning. Roads were flooding, power lines down. The security team advised everyone to stay put, just for the night. Most guests left quickly, escorted to the nearest boutique inn down the road. But Victoria and Nathaniel, they stayed. The storm was worsening, and the estate had enough rooms. It made sense. At least that's what they told themselves. The electricity flickered as the staff prepared guest rooms. The fireplaces were lit, candles placed in every corner. Victoria was shown to a room upstairs, one with soft beige curtains and a bed too big for her tired frame. She sat on the edge, removing her earrings in the dim light, listening to the thunder rumble through the valley like a restless heart. Down the hall, Nathaniel stood near a fireplace in the old library, holding a glass of wine he hadn't touched. His jacket was folded neatly on a chair, his tie loosened, but his mind, while it wasn't where it should be, it was with her. Not in a romantic sense, not yet, but in that quiet, aching awareness that something had been growing between them. Unnamed and ignored, and tonight it no longer felt easy to pretend it wasn't there. He wandered down the corridor, telling himself he needed tea, or maybe just air, something to justify the way his feet carried him to her door. But before he could knock, it opened. Victoria stood there in silence, barefoot, hair damp from the bathroom steam, wrapped in a long knit sweater over her nightdress. No makeup, no armor, just her, real, present. They stared at each other for a moment too long. "The storm is wild tonight," she said softly, as if afraid to break the air between them. He nodded. "I couldn't sleep." "Me neither." A pause. A choice. I was going to the kitchen, she added almost apologetically. For tea. I'll come with you, he said. And just like that, something changed. Downstairs, the kitchen was dark except for the faint glow of a lantern on the counter. She moved with ease, opening cupboards, boiling water. He watched her, not in the way men watch women, but in the way someone watches a memory form. They didn't speak much, just moved in quiet rhythm. Two strangers who knew each other's. Silence better than words. She handed him a mug without asking what he liked. He didn't correct her. It was perfect. In the candlelight, their eyes met again, longer this time. You don't talk much, she whispered. Neither do you. But you notice everything, she added, her voice barely audible over the wind. Outside, he didn't deny it. And then a flicker, a moment, a pull. He reached out, slow, deliberate, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek. She didn't move away. In fact, she leaned slightly into his touch. Neither of them breathed, and then it happened. A kiss, not urgent or fiery, but gentle, testing, honest, like two people remembering how it feels to be human again. When they pulled away, their foreheads rested together. I don't know what this means, she confessed. Neither do I, he replied, but in that instant it didn't matter. They stayed up for hours, not speaking much, just existing in that rare space where fear and desire meet, without needing answers. No promises were made, no boundaries were declared, just presence. Later they returned to their rooms, separate still, but forever changed. Victoria lay in bed with the sheets pulled to her chin, her heart louder than the thunder outside. She didn't know what the morning would bring, but for the first time in months she wasn't cold. And Nathaniel? He stood by the window, staring out into the rain with his hands in his pockets. Something inside him had cracked open. But cracks, as he knew too well, don't always lead to light. Sometimes they invite the fear of what comes next. The morning after the storm, the mansion looked different. Not because the walls had shifted or the rain had cleared, but because something between Victoria and Nathaniel had quietly, irreversibly changed. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt charged. Back in Manhattan, life resumed its pattern. Meetings, deadlines, social obligations. But they weren't the same people who had driven up to Hudson Valley 2 days before. They had kissed, not out of passion, but recognition. Out of the aching need to feel seen. Still, neither spoke of it. Back in their penthouse, they didn't mention the tea, the shared candlelight, the kiss. Nathaniel buried himself in reports and travel planning. Victoria returned to her cases. But something lingered in the space between them. A warmth, an electricity, a question. The shift was subtle. A glance held longer than necessary. A hand brushing past in the hallway, not pulled back too quickly. The sound of footsteps near each other's doors late at night. Nothing concrete, yet undeniable. And then came the power outage. It was a Thursday evening. Victoria had just returned from court, her heels in one hand, exhaustion clinging to her bones. Nathaniel had been working from home, his office door slightly ajar, jazz playing softly from the speakers. Outside, a sudden summer storm rolled in, fierce and uninvited. Without warning, the lights flickered, and then went out. Victoria stood frozen in the hallway, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Darkness wrapped around the apartment, broken, only by the soft blue-grey of the storm outside. "Victoria?" His voice came from down the corridor. She turned. "I'm here." He stepped into view, holding a small flashlight. "Generator should kick in soon." "It's fine," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "I kind of like it." He tilted his head. "Like what?" The quiet. The pause. No noise, no performance. Nathaniel paused, flashlight casting shadows across his features. "You always carry so much, don't you?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, slowly. "You wear elegance like armor. But that night in Hudson, you let it go. Just for a moment." Her breath caught. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them. like someone who had actually looked at her past the layers. "I didn't think you noticed," she said. "I noticed everything." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. She leaned against the wall, rain thudding against the tall windows. The smell of petrichor drifted in from the balcony door she had forgotten to close. Everything about that moment was still, but alive. And then he stepped closer. Their hands met first, barely touching, then fingers intertwined, uncertain, but willing. He reached for her cheek the same way he had days ago, but this time he didn't stop. His hand traced the curve of her jaw, slid into her hair. Her breath shivered at the contact. He wasn't forceful, he wasn't hesitant, he was present. Their lips met again. But this kiss was not like the first. It was deeper, slower. Like reading a book you never thought you'd find yourself in. Like finding warmth after years of emotional winter. There was no rush, no performance, just a knowing. He pulled her closer, and she rested her forehead against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady, but louder than she expected. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "I don't either," he said, "but I don't want it to be nothing." They stayed like that, holding each other in the storm-dimmed room, letting the silence speak the truths neither knew how to say yet. Later, they didn't go to separate rooms. They didn't go to his or hers. They sat on the couch barefoot, sipping tea she had made, the lights still out. She wrapped herself in a blanket. He leaned back, one hand resting lightly over hers, never letting go. No lines were drawn, no future mapped, no promises exchanged. But something sacred had begun. That night, Victoria fell asleep on the sofa, her head on his shoulder. Nathaniel stayed awake, not because he was unsure, but because for the first time in years he didn't want to miss a single second of this, of her, of whatever this was becoming, slowly, gently, unstoppably. And yet, as dawn approached and the power returned, a thought crept into his mind, something that hadn't haunted him in years. Could he actually allow himself to feel? Because feeling meant risk, and risk meant pain. And pain was the one thing he had built his entire life to avoid. The morning sun over Tribeca was soft, filtered through the sheer curtains of the living room where Victoria woke, alone. The couch beneath her felt cold, though it hadn't when she drifted off. Nathaniel was gone, not in the kitchen, not in the hallway. His absence was the first thing she felt before she even opened her eyes, and something in her already knew what that meant. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her, as if it could still hold the warmth he had left behind. But warmth, she quickly realized, had never been his promise. On the marble counter in the kitchen, she found a note, clean handwriting, folded neatly. Had to step out early. Meetings in Midtown. Don't wait for dinner. N. No good. Morning. No mention of the night, no trace of the vulnerability he had shown. Victoria stared at the note, her fingers curling around the edge. The message was polite, efficient, empty, exactly like him. Only now, it wasn't enough. The silence that had once felt like a peace treaty now felt like betrayal. She spent the day distracted. Her assistant had to repeat questions. Her mind wandered during client calls. Every quiet moment felt louder than it should, echoing with last night's touch, his breath against her skin, the way he had held her like he didn't want to let go. But he had. He let go the second morning light threatened to make the night real. When he returned that evening, it was late, and after 10 p.m., he moved through the apartment with the familiarity of someone used to walking alone. No greetings, no acknowledgement, just the soft sound of keys on the marble tray and the shuffle of expensive shoes on hardwood floors. Victoria stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the lights of the city flicker below. She didn't turn. When he entered, she waited. Let him speak first. He didn't. After a full minute, she asked, "Is that it?" Nathaniel paused near the hallway, his hand still in the pocket of his coat. "Is what it—" She turned slowly. "You disappeared, left a note, didn't say a word." He blinked, his expression unreadable. "I had meetings." Don't do that, she said, her voice sharpening. Don't pretend this is about your calendar. He looked away. It was a moment, Victoria, that's all. She laughed, not bitter but deeply wounded. A moment? That's what you're calling it. He didn't respond. She took a step toward him. You held me like I was more than a name on a contract. You looked at me like you saw me. You kissed me like, her voice cracked, like it meant something. Still, he said nothing, so she delivered the final blow herself. You erased it. His eyes met hers. At last, it was a mistake. The words hit harder than any silence ever could. She stood frozen, blinking fast to hide the sting. Thank you for the clarity, she whispered. And then she walked away. Not because she wanted to, but because if she didn't, she'd break. Nathaniel stood there for a long time after she disappeared down the hallway. The echo of her footsteps faded too quickly, leaving only his regret behind. He wasn't heartless, but he was terrified. Terrified of what she was unlocking inside him, because Nathaniel had spent his entire life mastering control of his company, his reputation, his decisions. And feelings? Feelings were chaos. They made you weak, made you bleed. And Victoria, she was becoming a mirror, one that showed him everything he had buried long ago. The next few days passed like ghosts. They returned to their roles, civil, distant, practiced. Victoria no longer made 2 cups of tea, just one. She no longer left notes or touched his. Arm when passing. She worked longer hours, came home later, let silence answer any unasked questions. Nathaniel, in turn, watched her slip away. He noticed the change. Of course he did. But instead of reaching out, he buried himself deeper into routine, numbers, calls, charity galas, board meetings. He told himself it was safer this way, cleaner. And yet every night when he stood at the same kitchen counter and looked at the empty space where she once stood, something inside him twisted. Regret. Maybe. Or maybe it was just the growing realization that what he had always feared was already happening. He was losing her, not in the dramatic, romantic sense, but in the quiet, permanent kind of way, the kind you don't recover from. And still, he said nothing. Because for men, like Nathaniel Hayes, speaking meant surrender, and surrender had never been an option until now. Some heartbreaks don't come with shouting or slamming doors. Some arrive in silence, in a manila envelope left neatly on a desk. Victoria saw it the moment she entered her office that morning, a cream-colored folder resting precisely at the center of her desk, with her name handwritten on the top. No flowers, no explanation, just the weight of something final. She already knew what it was. Her breath caught, but her hands were steady as she opened it. Inside, divorce papers, clean, flawless, clinical, and at the bottom of the last page, Nathaniel's signature. Cold ink on cold paper. No note, no message, not even a post-it. He hadn't spoken to her about it. Hadn't looked her in the eyes, hadn't even sent an email. Just this, like she was another transaction to be processed and dissolved. Victoria stared at her name printed beside his, thinking about how often she had signed other people's contracts, watched other marriages dissolve. But this felt like her lungs were folding in on themselves. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply closed the folder, sat at her desk, and let the silence settle like dust over everything. By the afternoon, she was knocking on his office door. Nathaniel didn't expect to see her. He looked up from his laptop, startled for just a second before slipping back into his usual mask. She held the folder in her hand. "You didn't even have the decency to tell me?" she asked. He leaned back in his chair, composed. "I thought it was clear." She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. "Clear? What? That you kissed me, held me, slept next to me, and then signed your name like it all meant nothing?" I didn't mean anything," he said, too quickly. And just like that, the breath she was holding collapsed in her chest. "You coward," she whispered. "You felt something, and it scared you." Nathaniel stood. "It wasn't supposed to happen, Victoria. This marriage, it wasn't meant to be real." "But it became real," she snapped. You made it real the second you let your walls down, the second you looked at me like I mattered. Don't pretend you didn't feel it. I'm not pretending, he said. I'm protecting us. From what? She asked. From the risk of being human? His silence was answer enough. She shook her head slowly. You don't get it, do you? I wasn't asking for everything. I wasn't even asking for love. I was asking for honesty, for courage. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in days, but it was too late. She placed the folder back on his desk. I'll sign it. Don't worry. I won't make this messy. Victoria, he began, but the words fell short. She turned, hand on the doorknob. You could have had me, she said softly. Not the contract, me, and all you had to do was show up. The door closed quietly behind her. That night she didn't go home. She checked into a small boutique hotel downtown, the kind with exposed brick walls and no room service. She needed space, not just from Nathaniel, but from the version of herself that had waited too long for him to be brave. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, wondering how something so cold could still hurt so deeply, wondering why it was always the quiet men who left the loudest wounds. Back at the penthouse, Nathaniel sat in the dark, the divorce papers still unopened on his desk. He hadn't touched them since she left. The city below flickered with life, but his world had grown unbearably still. He poured himself a drink, then didn't drink it. He picked up his phone, then didn't call. He sat in silence. He thought about her laugh, the one he rarely heard, but always felt when it happened. About the way she bit her lip when trying not to cry. About the night on the couch, her head resting against his chest like it belonged there. He remembered how safe it felt, how dangerous it felt. And still, he said nothing, because that was what Nathaniel Hayes did best. He stayed silent, and silence this time might cost him everything. Victoria had always trusted her body to speak clearly. In court, in meetings, in life, she moved with the certainty of someone who knew her limits. But lately, that clarity had disappeared. She was exhausted. Not the usual wear and tear of long work days, but something deeper. Her skin felt overly sensitive. Her appetite danced between extremes. And the nausea? It arrived like a whisper each morning, subtle but persistent. She ignored it, at first, attributing it to stress, to the divorce papers, to the ache of disappointment she was trying to bury. But the signs multiplied. Then came the moment that couldn't be ignored. She was sitting in her office, reviewing a deposition, when a wave of dizziness overtook her so quickly she had to grip the edge of the desk. The room spun. Her breath caught. That night, standing barefoot in the bathroom of her hotel room, she stared at the pregnancy test in her hand. One of 3 she'd bought on the way home, just to be sure. 2 pink lines. She didn't move. Didn't cry. Didn't speak. She just stood there staring at the result as the world tilted under her feet. She was pregnant, from the one night that wasn't supposed to exist. The night he pretended didn't matter. And now, everything had changed. The next morning, Victoria sat in the corner booth of a quiet cafe downtown, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, trying to think clearly. The city buzzed around her, alive with distractions. But inside, she was still. There was no question in her mind she would keep the baby, not out of rebellion or desperation, but out of something deeper. Something that told her that this child, this life, was not a mistake, even if everything around it had felt like one. She wasn't afraid of motherhood. She was afraid of bringing a child into a fractured story. Still, she chose to believe that love could be built from broken things. But Nathaniel? That was the question that hovered over everything. Would he see this child as an interruption? Another contract to manage? Another responsibility to outsource? Or would he feel what she had felt the moment those 2 lines appeared? That something sacred had entered the room. She didn't know, but she had to tell him. Later that week, she messaged his assistant directly, asking for a brief meeting at his office. No details. No context. When Nathaniel saw her name on his calendar, He stared at it for 5 minutes before clicking away. He hadn't seen her in nearly a week, not since she returned the divorce folder and walked out with words that still echoed at night. "You could have had me." He wondered what she would say now, if she would sign the papers, if she'd come to finalize everything as clean, cold, complete. But when she walked into his office that afternoon, there was something different about her. She looked calm, not composed, not guarded, but grounded. He stood, unsure what to say. "Victoria," she gave a small nod, "I won't take much of your time." "Please." He gestured toward the chair. She sat, reaching into her purse and pulling out an envelope. Not manila this time. Soft, cream-colored, almost delicate. He took it slowly, opening it without a word. Inside, a single image. A black and white ultrasound. A heartbeat caught in ink. He stared at it. His mind struggled to register what his eyes were already confirming. "Is this?" She nodded. 7 weeks. Silence. Nathaniel blinked, then looked up at her. "You're pregnant." "Yes." Another. Pause, and it's mine. She tilted her head slightly. "We both know there was only one night." He stared at the image again, and for the first time in a long time something in him cracked, not loudly, but deeply. He didn't know what to say. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she continued gently. "I'm going to keep the baby, with or without your involvement. This isn't a threat or an appeal, it's just the truth." He placed the photo carefully on his desk. "I want to be part of it," he said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "Not because I have to, because I want to." She searched his face for signs of performance, of hesitation, but what she saw wasn't calculation. It was vulnerability. "And if I don't want a relationship with you," she asked, testing him, "then I'll still show up," he replied. "As a father, as someone who made a mistake and wants to do better." The room grew quiet again. Then slowly she nodded. "That's a start." He stood and stepped around the desk, standing a few feet away from her. Not too close, not too far. "I know I hurt you," he said. "And I can't take that back. But maybe this is something we build, not just for the baby, but for us, if you'll let me." She didn't respond right away, because sometimes words aren't the beginning. Sometimes presence is. Victoria stood, picking up her purse. "I'll let you know when the next appointment is." And just like that she walked out, not angry, not broken, but in control. And this time, Nathaniel didn't sit back down. He stood there, one hand resting on the edge of the desk, staring at the image of their child. And for the first time he smiled, not out of relief, but out of something terrifyingly real. Hope. Nathaniel Hayes was used to control. He had mastered it. In boardrooms, on stages, in crises. His empire was built on discipline, on precision, on silence. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the quiet chaos that entered the room's EU. Moment Victoria handed him that ultrasound image, he couldn't stop looking at it. That night, long after the office lights dimmed and the city pulsed outside, Nathaniel remained seated at his desk, the photo still in front of him. It was small, blurry, but it had shifted something tectonic inside him. There in black and white was evidence of a life he helped create. Not through planning or contract, but through a moment of vulnerability he had tried so hard to erase. He hadn't cried in years, but sitting there alone with that photo, he felt something crack. A warmth that reached into a part of him he thought had long since calcified. He didn't cry, but he came close. In the days that followed, Nathaniel showed up, not with apologies or grand gestures, but with presence. He messaged Victoria the next morning, "If you're open to it, I'd like to come with you to the next appointment." She didn't reply immediately. He waited. A few hours later, she sent a short response. "Tuesday, 10 a.m., Midtown Women's Clinic." That Tuesday he was there, early, dressed simply, no bodyguard, no assistant, just him. When Victoria arrived, he stood as she entered, unsure if he should greet her with a hug, a handshake, or just a nod. She walked past him, her expression unreadable, and signed in at the reception. They sat in silence in the waiting room, but not the old kind of silence. The cold, empty one. This was new. A silence filled with tension, yes, Khan, but also with anticipation, with breath, with unspoken things. When the nurse called her name, Victoria hesitated, then turned back slightly. "Are you coming?" Nathaniel stood without a word and followed. The appointment was brief. The technician explained everything kindly, measurements, growth, next steps. And when the monitor turned on and the sound of the heartbeat filled the room, something happened. Nathaniel inhaled sharply. It was fast, strong, real. He looked at Victoria. She was crying silently, one hand resting on her abdomen, eyes closed. He didn't touch her, but his presence wrapped around her like something unspoken and protective. Afterward, they walked out together. Not touching, not talking, just breathing in the same space. Outside on the sidewalk, she finally spoke. "I don't know what this will look like." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I'm scared," she added. He looked at her. "Me too." It was the most honest exchange they had ever had. Over the next few weeks, he began showing up in small ways. A care package left at her hotel door, ginger tea, crackers, prenatal vitamins, a note with no signature, text messages, brief but intentional. "Did the nausea ease up today? Don't skip dinner. I left soup with the concierge. There's a good OB near Central Park if you want another option." He wasn't forcing himself into her life. He was simply there. And Victoria, though cautious, began to let him. Not completely, but enough. They started sharing information, appointments, changes, future logistics. Who would handle what? Where she might move once the baby came, what kind of birth plan she wanted, whether they should hire help. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was real. One evening, after her latest checkup, Victoria found herself back at the penthouse, at his invitation, just for tea, he said, just to talk. She hesitated at the door. Everything inside her told her to keep the distance. But something softer, quieter, told her that maybe, just maybe, she needed to see if he meant it. So she went in. The place looked the same, but the energy had shifted. There was a blanket folded on the couch, a tea kettle whistling in the kitchen, books stacked beside a half-read parenting guide, and in the center of it all, Nathaniel, no tie, sleeves rolled up, trying. They sat across from each other, steam rising between them. She asked, "Why are you doing this?" He met her eyes. "Because I don't want to be the man who walks away. From the baby? From you? From what I destroyed?" She studied him, unsure of what to believe. "You can't erase what you did." "I know," he said. "But maybe I can replace it, choice by choice." That sentence stayed with her long after she left, because it didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a man beginning to understand what it meant to show up, and even though her heart was still, guarded, and the pain still sat under her ribs like a stone. A door had opened, one that neither of them had dared to knock on before. Love doesn't always arrive with declarations or roses. Sometimes it tiptoes in, soft, steady, and uninvited, through a gesture so simple it would go unnoticed by anyone else. Nathaniel didn't say he loved her. He didn't ask for forgiveness. But he started showing up, not with flowers but with presence, a peeled orange on the counter before she arrived, the soft hum of her favorite instrumental playlist echoing faintly through the living room, bottled water in the guest bedroom, now hers and chilled just how she liked it. His gestures weren't loud, but they were deliberate. At first, Victoria didn't know what to do with it. She had built walls to survive the disappointment. Her trust had once been tender, now it was tempered steel. But Nathaniel wasn't trying to climb the wall. He was simply waiting by the gate, quietly, every day, proving he could be there when it mattered. Their communication changed. It wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about her, about him. About the quiet spaces between what they said and what they avoided. One afternoon she came home exhausted from a prenatal yoga class her friend had convinced her to try. Her back ached. Her mood was frayed. She dropped her keys with a sigh. expecting an empty apartment. But there he was, sitting on the floor, laptop open, surrounded by books about fatherhood and newborn development. A tray with herbal tea and a hot compress waited beside the sofa. He stood when he saw her. "I heard prenatal yoga can be cruel," he said gently. She blinked, stunned. "You were waiting?" He shrugged. "I figured you'd need tea. And something. For your back." She didn't speak. She just walked over, sat down slowly, and let the silence settle. And then, softly, "Thank you." He didn't answer with words. He simply handed her the hot compress, placed the blanket over her lap, and sat beside her. That night they talked, not about the past, not about the mistakes, but about books, about childhood memories, about dreams they used to have before life got loud. They laughed, and it felt real. Nathaniel had a quiet way of studying her now, not with possession, but with reverence, as if memorizing her expressions, her rhythms, the way her hands moved when she spoke. Victoria noticed things too. The way his voice softened when talking to her belly, the way he kept a calendar of all her appointments on his phone, the way he started saying we instead of you. There were no grand gestures, just quiet consistency. A week later, she found a notebook in the kitchen drawer with a note on the cover. For the baby, 1 page a day. Inside, his handwriting. Neat, careful. Letters to a child who had not yet arrived. "I want you to know I wasn't ready. But I'm trying. Every single day, your mom is the bravest person I know. Today I bought a crib. I stared at it for a full hour. I still don't believe this is real. I hope you get her smile." Victoria closed the notebook, her throat tight. She pressed it to her chest, not ready to cry, not ready to speak, just ready to feel. Because the man who once disappeared into silence was now showing up, 1 page at a time. They began spending evenings together, preparing for the baby, shopping for soft blankets, arguing gently over color palettes, laughing about stroller features neither of them understood. Every choice was layered with tenderness. One evening, while folding baby clothes in the living room, Nathaniel paused. Hand looked at her. "You still wear the ring," he said quietly. She glanced at her hand. She had almost forgotten. The ring he had given her on their wedding day, not out of love but out of obligation, still rested on her finger. But now it felt different. "I don't wear it for what it meant," she replied softly. "I wear it for what it could mean." He didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at her with that same expression he had in Hudson Valley, the night everything shifted. Raw, undone. "Do you believe in second chances?" he asked. "I believe in effort," she said, "and in the people who show up even after they fail." Silence lingered between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. Full of everything they were building, not on promises, but on presence, on dishes washed without being asked, on prenatal vitamins refilled without reminders, on laughter that returned like sunlight through curtains once drawn too tight. Victoria still slept in the guest room, and Nathaniel never crossed that line. Not yet. Because love this time wasn't about urgency, it was about rebuilding, not with bricks of apology, but with consistent, quiet hands. And still, some nights, they sat beside each other on the couch, the baby kicking softly between them, and said nothing at all, because sometimes the most honest kind of love says everything, without saying a single word. The city was asleep when it began. It was just past 3 a.m. when Victoria sat up in bed, a strange tightness curling across her lower back. She had felt discomfort before, the kind that came and went like tides. But this was different. It wrapped around her like a belt of pressure, sharp and low and deep. She waited, counted her breaths, closed her eyes. 20 minutes later it came again, and again. The pain wasn't panicked, it was sacred, as if her body was gently announcing that something long awaited was about to begin. She stood slowly, resting her hand on the curve of her belly. He was coming, her son. She didn't scream or rush. She moved quietly, methodically, showered, braided her hair, slipped into the dress she had already set aside for this moment. Then she called him, Nathaniel answered on the second ring. His voice was groggy but clear. "Are you okay?" "I think it's time." Silence. "Then I'm coming now." She didn't ask him to. She didn't need to. He arrived 17 minutes later, shirt slightly misbuttoned, jacket in hand, eyes wide but steady. She opened the door and looked at him, trying to read what he was feeling. But he didn't say much, just took her hospital, bag from her hands and whispered, "Let's go." The ride was quiet, not from fear but from reverence. At the hospital, time blurred. Monitors beeped, nurses moved in careful rhythm. Victoria breathed through each contraction, eyes focused, jaw tight. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She let the waves of pain rise and fall, one after the other, as if she'd trained her whole life for this sacred storm. Nathaniel stayed close. He didn't try to control. He didn't overstep. He was simply there, holding her hand when she reached for it, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, speaking only when she needed him to. "You're doing amazing," he whispered more than once, and each time she believed him. Hours passed like lifetimes, and then suddenly everything rushed. Doctors moved quickly. Lights shifted. Voices rose. Victoria gripped his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He was her anchor in the chaos, the one steady breath in a world unraveling. And then a cry. Small, sharp, perfect. Their son. Victoria exhaled in a sob that wasn't sadness or relief, but something far more ancient. A release, a surrender, a beginning. They placed the baby on her chest, and she stared at him as if she had known him her entire life. Tiny fists, damp hair, eyes still closed but already speaking to her soul. Nathaniel hovered beside her, afraid to move. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. She lifted the baby gently, placed him in Nathaniel's arms, and for the first time in his life, the man who had built empires, negotiated mergers, and faced down boardrooms without blinking, trembled. He looked down at the baby and something broke wide open. All the walls, all the silence, all the cold logic that once defined him. Gone. "Hi," he said softly to his son. "You're here." Victoria watched him, eyes full. "You're not who I thought you were," she said. He looked at her, startled. She smiled. "You're more." That night, they didn't talk about the future, didn't talk about what they were or weren't. They just existed in the sacred space between exhaustion and awe. Victoria drifted to sleep first, the baby in her arms, Nathaniel beside them, eyes open, watching over both. He didn't sleep. He didn't want to. He just sat there listening to the steady rhythm of their breathing, protecting, remembering, becoming. At dawn, he stepped into the hallway, the sky outside turning soft shades of gold and grey. He called the concierge and had fresh flowers delivered to the hospital room, nothing grand. Just lilies, her favourite. He cancelled all his meetings for the week, and then he made a decision, not one born of guilt or obligation, but of choice, because in that hospital room, with his son in his arms and the woman he'd nearly lost asleep, beside him, Nathaniel Hayes finally understood something that had evaded him for years. You don't build a life out of perfection, you build it out of presence, and he was ready, not just to be a father, but to be someone worthy of being chosen. The apartment didn't feel the same. Maybe it was the crib in the corner of the living room still half assembled. Maybe it was the stack of clean onesies on the sofa. Or maybe it was the quiet hum of new life pulsing through every room. Whatever. It was. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. Victoria came home from the hospital 2 days after the birth. Nathaniel insisted on carrying her bag. He adjusted the car seat 5 times before settling it. He drove slowly, his hand reaching out at every red light just to check if the baby was still sleeping. Back in the penthouse, he opened the door like it was sacred, because it was. He didn't say anything dramatic, didn't offer speeches or sudden declarations. He just made her tea, adjusted the thermostat, turned the lights down low, and when Victoria laid their son, Edward, In the bassinet by the window, Nathaniel stood beside her, silent. "He looks like you," she whispered. Nathaniel shook his head. "He looks like everything I never knew I needed." They didn't kiss, they didn't touch. But in that moment, something was sealed. The first few nights were chaos. Edward cried like the world was ending every 3 hours. Victoria barely slept. Her body ached in ways she couldn't name. Emotions rose and fell without warning. Joy, fear, awe, exhaustion. And through it all, Nathaniel stayed. He learned how to warm bottles, how to hold Edward so he'd stop crying, how to change diapers one-handed. He Googled everything from cluster feeding to why is baby hiccuping, non-stop. He didn't complain. He didn't run. Every morning, Victoria would wake to find the kitchen clean, her tea already steeping, and a tiny note beside it. "You slept an extra hour. I handled the 4 a.m. feeding. He only cried twice." The notes changed. Daily. Sometimes they made her smile. Sometimes they made her cry. But always, they made her feel chosen. They had no label, no title, no vow. But what they had was rhythm. In the middle of the night, while Edward slept curled against her chest, Nathaniel would sit at the edge of the bed and read quietly from a parenting book. Not for show, for understanding. One night she asked him, "Why are you still here?" He looked up from the page. "Because I missed enough already." He didn't ask for her back. He didn't try to rewrite the past. He just showed up. And slowly something began to shift inside her, not all at once, not in a sudden sweeping forgiveness, but in tiny, quiet moments, like the time he fell asleep on the nursery floor, holding Edward against his chest, or when he started, bringing her favorite chocolate from the cafe downstairs, even when she hadn't asked, or when he stopped scheduling meetings after 5 p.m. just to make sure he was home for bedtime. Love wasn't reborn in a grand gesture. It was built, moment by moment. They began sharing more than just parenting tasks. They cooked together, laughed over burnt toast, played soft jazz in the mornings while Edward napped in a sling strapped to Nathaniel's chest. Sometimes he'd sway gently with the baby while reading emails on his phone. Other times, he'd just stand still, eyes closed, breathing in the scent of fatherhood. Victoria watched him day after day, noticing the man behind the suits, the softness beneath the silence. She still wore the ring, not as a symbol of marriage, but as a reminder that love wasn't a promise made once. It was a choice renewed every morning. One rainy Sunday, while folding tiny laundry, Nathaniel looked up and asked, "Do you think we'll ever be more again?" She didn't answer right away, because the truth was that they already were, not more in the romantic sense, but more in the real sense, more present, more aware, more whole. She smiled softly. "We already are. We're just different now." He nodded, accepting that truth like a vow. Later that night, after Edward finally fell asleep, Victoria walked into the kitchen and found Nathaniel writing in the baby notebook again. She peeked over his shoulder. "Today, I saw your mom laugh with her whole face. I think I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of man that keeps her smiling like that." Victoria didn't say a word. She just placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and for the first time since everything began, he placed his hand over hers and didn't let go. There was no dramatic proposal, no grand gesture under the rain, no music swelling in the background, no sudden declarations in a crowded room. What Victoria and Nathaniel found wasn't a love story made for film. It was something far more difficult, far more beautiful. It was real. Love, they learned, isn't built in a day. It's not rescued by one night of passion or repaired by the birth of a child. Love is made in the quiet spaces, in the 4 a.m. feedings, in the arguments over how to fold baby blankets, in the willingness to apologize without pride and forgive, without demand. They became a team, not perfect, but present. Every morning began with tiny rituals, Nathaniel warming bottles, while Victoria stretched her back beside the crib, her writing emails on her phone while he danced slowly with Edward in the kitchen. A kiss on the forehead here, a hand on the shoulder there. Intimacy so small they might seem invisible to anyone else, but they were the glue holding it all together. They never redefined their relationship with words. They didn't label what was happening, because what they were building didn't need explanation. It needed intention. And that, finally, they both had. On Edward's 3-month milestone, they went for a walk in the park. It was cold, but the sun was soft, breaking through the bare branches in golden threads. Victoria pushed the stroller while Nathaniel walked beside her, a thermos of tea in one hand, his free hand brushing lightly against hers now and then. They talked about nothing and everything. About how Edward always furrowed his brow like Nathaniel when he was confused. About how Victoria secretly sang to him in French when no one was around. About how terrifying and miraculous it was to love someone so small, so fiercely. At one point, Nathaniel stopped walking. Victoria looked back. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then, "Do you ever think about what this is, what we've become?" She didn't answer right away. She glanced down at Edward, peacefully asleep beneath his tiny blanket, then back at the man beside her. "I think," she said slowly, "we stopped trying to define it the moment we started living it." He smiled, just a little. "Is that enough?" "It's more than enough," she replied, "because every day we wake up and choose again." He nodded, and they kept walking. There were still hard days, days when exhaustion won, when old wounds bled through soft moments, when Victoria's fears crept back in, when Nathaniel's silence returned like a shadow trying to reclaim its place. But they never let it stay, for long, because now they had something neither of them had before, not love but truth, and with truth they could rebuild anything. One quiet evening after Edward had fallen asleep, they sat side by side on the couch. No words, just warmth. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He laced his fingers through hers, and for the first time, it didn't feel like they were trying to recover from the past. It felt like they were planting the future. Later, Nathaniel whispered, "I used to think love was about certainty." Victoria turned slightly. "And now?" He looked at her, his gaze soft. "Now I know it's about choice." She didn't need to say anything, because she agreed. It wasn't the fairy tale she once read about as a girl. It didn't come tied with a ribbon or sealed with a kiss under fireworks. But it was real, it was messy, it was honest. And most of all, it was theirs. A story that began with a contract. That cracked open in silence. That found truth in a shared heartbeat, and chose to keep going even when neither of them had the perfect words for it. Because love isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of someone who stays, even after the pain. And so every morning, in the quiet kitchen filled with steam from tea and baby bottles, they made the same unspoken promise. Not to be perfect, not to be traditional, but to show up, to hold space, to choose again and again and again. Because sometimes the greatest love stories don't end with a kiss. They begin with a quiet decision to stay. Not every love begins with passion. Some are born in silence, they are built in pain, and they blossom in the daily choice to stay, even when it would be easier to walk away. Victoria and Nathaniel didn't have a fairy tale, but every day they chose to write a story only they could live. No perfect promises, no endings wrapped in ribbons, just presence, truth, and the kind of love that's built with both hands. And you? Do you believe that love can be born after pain and survive even when everything seems to be lost? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your like helps this channel grow and continue bringing emotional stories like this. Share with someone special.